56 feet long, 2.5 tons of steel, buried under no man's land, in a tunnel, pointing at the German line. This is a British flamethrower, the Livens large gallery flame projector, and it took a carrying party of 300 men to bring it to the front in pieces and assemble it underground, where it sat in the dark, waiting for a morning that had already been chosen. That morning was the 1st of July 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. You already know what happened that day. Something close to 60,000 British casualties before nightfall, around 20,000 of them dead. The worst single day the British Army has ever had. And the event that has become shorthand for everything that went wrong on the Western Front. Here is the part that is almost never mentioned. In one or two narrow sectors of that front, the attack went almost exactly as planned. The infantry crossed, took the German front line, and did it at a cost their commanders would have called cheap. And in those sectors, something had come out of the ground first. So the question worth asking is not how big the flames were. It is why the British Army built a weapon whose main purpose was not to kill the men in front of it, but to drive them off their own parapet. And then, having watched it work, never really used it again. The man who designed it was a Royal Engineers officer named William Howard Livens, and almost everything written about him leads back to a story that may not be true. The story goes like this. Livens joined the army on the day war was declared, wanted action, and found himself stuck at the Royal Engineers depot at Chatham. Then, on the 7th of May 1915, a German submarine sank the liner Lusitania off the Irish coast, and Livens was told his fiancée had been aboard. He swore he would kill as many Germans as the ship had killed civilians, a number close to 1,200. 3 days later, he learned she had missed the sailing. It is a magnificent story, and it has a hole in it. Livens did not marry until 1916, which makes some versions of the account impossible as written. His commanding officer, Charles Folks, who later wrote the history of the unit, referred only to a strong personal feeling connected with the sinking, and left it at that. The more sober explanation is on the record and fits the dates better. On the 22nd of April 1915, 2 weeks before the Lusitania went down, the German army released chlorine gas at Ypres, the first large-scale use of poison gas in the war. Livens himself said his experimental work began at the end of that April, so the honest version is less romantic and considerably more disturbing. The weapon is not the product of one man's broken heart. It is the product of an institutional decision, taken calmly, that if the other side was going to open that door, then Britain would walk through it as well. That distinction matters for everything that follows. A grieving man building a revenge machine is a tragedy, and tragedies require nobody else to answer for them. A government standing up a specialist branch to develop flame and gas, staffing it, funding it, and giving it a letter of the alphabet for a name, is a policy. And policies have authors. Livens was given command of a unit designated Z Company inside what became the Special Brigade, the Royal Engineers formation that handled gas and flame, and which occupies an awkward corner of British military history for obvious reasons. He had a model to work from. The Germans had fielded man-portable flamethrowers at Hooge in the summer of 1915, and the British had seen at close range what those did to a trench and to the men holding it. The reports that came back were not really about casualties. They were about what the survivors did, which was leave. Livens' idea was to take that weapon and make it enormous. To see what he was solving, you have to start with why a portable flamethrower is a bad weapon. Its range is short, shorter than most people imagine, and nothing at all beside a rifle. The man carrying it has to get close, in the open, on ground swept by machine guns, with the fuel on his back. That makes him the single most conspicuous and most desirable target anywhere on the battlefield. Everyone shoots at him, and if they hit what he is carrying, the problem tends to resolve itself. The German answer to this had been, more or less, to accept the losses and send the man anyway. Livens' answer was to stop sending him. If the weapon could not survive crossing no man's land, then the weapon should already be there when the attack began. That is the whole idea, and it is the reason for the size. The machine was built to be assembled inside a shallow tunnel, a sap, driven out under no man's land by the tunnelling companies for that purpose alone. It lay in the dark down the length of that tunnel. Compressed gas drove a piston along the 14-inch body of the machine, forcing oil through the projector's pipework to a nozzle at the far end. The only part of the entire apparatus that ever broke the surface was that nozzle, pushed up through the ground at the last possible moment. Consider what that required. The tunnel had to be dug in silence, under an enemy listening for exactly that. The machine had to be carried up in sections, at night, by men who could not be told what they were carrying. It had to be assembled underground, in the dark, by a crew of 7 or 8. Then it had to be loaded, a job nobody who did it wrote about with any affection, and left sitting there, full, until the morning. The range was somewhere around 100 to 130 feet. It could fire 3 bursts of about 10 seconds each, and then it was empty. 3 bursts. 30 seconds of fire in total from all that machinery, all those men, and weeks of tunnelling that could get you killed on its own. Set that against an artillery piece, which can fire for a week. Set it against a machine gun, which one man can carry and which will keep working all day. By any measure, an ordnance committee would recognise this is a catastrophic return on investment. And it would be, if killing had been the point. It was not. The historian Peter Barton, who led the team that dug one of these up, put the intention plainly. The idea was to fill the enemy with terror. That is the design brief, entire. Once you see it, the machine stops looking absurd. The problem the British Army could not solve in 1916 was not how to kill Germans. Artillery killed Germans. The problem was the 90 seconds it took infantry to walk across no man's land, during which the defenders came up out of their dugouts, manned the parapet, and cut them down. Every disaster of that morning is a variation on that sentence. A weapon that killed 40 defenders would not change that. A weapon that kept 400 of them below the parapet for 90 seconds would change everything. Killing was not excluded. This was burning oil fired into an occupied trench, and it did what burning oil does. But killing was not the mechanism the plan depended on. Fire does that, not through what it does to a body. A bullet manages that more reliably and far more cheaply, but through its effect on everyone watching. A man who has just watched a wall of burning oil come up out of the earth in front of him is not, in that moment, a soldier operating a machine gun. He is a man getting away from fire, which is the oldest instruction any human being carries. So the Livens was a psychological instrument built at industrial scale. Its success will be measured in something that did not happen, in British infantry who were not shot, by German soldiers who were not at their posts. That is a strange thing to build a machine this size for. It is also, if you sit with it for a moment, a fair description of what a great deal of warfare is actually trying to do. 4 were built for the Somme. They went into saps dug for them near Mametz and Carnoy. And this is where it starts to go wrong, because the weakness of the design showed up before the thing was ever fired. On the 28th of June, 3 days before the attack, German shellfire found the workings and knocked out the 2 projectors near Mametz. That left 2 in saps 7 and 10 near Carnoy. Which is the first thing worth noticing about this weapon. Half of them were destroyed by chance, before the battle began, without the enemy ever knowing they were there. At about 7:15 that morning, 15 minutes before 0 hour, both fired into the German front line opposite. That trench was held by men of a Bavarian reserve regiment, recently moved into the sector, who had no idea what was underneath the ground in front of them. Try to picture it from their side, because that is where the weapon was aimed. The bombardment has been going for days and has just lifted. You are in a trench you moved into recently. Everything about the morning tells you an attack is coming, and everything you have been trained to do says get up on the parapet and be ready. And then the ground between you and the British splits open and throws fire at you. Not a shell, not a bullet, nothing that fits anything you have been taught. A nozzle you cannot see, from a machine that is not supposed to exist, in ground your own side has been holding and patrolling for months. What happened next is the reason this film exists. The infantry went over in that sector and took their objectives. Losses were low. In the middle of that catastrophe, on a front where whole battalions were being destroyed in minutes a few hundred yards away, the attack at Carnoy went in more or less as the plan said it would. It would be wrong to hand the flame projectors all the credit for that. The sector had other advantages. Less ground to cross, better artillery preparation, mines fired nearby, and a German garrison that was thinner than elsewhere on the line. Historians argue about the weighting and will go on arguing, and anyone who tells you the answer is settled is selling you something. But the sequence is not in dispute. Something rose out of a hole in no man's land and burned. And 15 minutes later, many of the men who should have been manning that stretch of German line had been driven off it, or suppressed, or shaken badly enough that the British advance met unusually light resistance. That is precisely the outcome the machine was designed to produce. It is the only day it ever fully produced it. And here is the fact that decides what the Livens actually was. It worked, and the British Army effectively stopped using it. There is one more recorded use in 1917 near Dixmude in Belgium. After that, nothing. The reasons are not mysterious, and every one of them had been visible on the morning it succeeded. 300 men to carry and assemble it, weeks of tunnelling to put it in position, a loading process nobody enjoyed. 3 bursts, and it was finished. A range measured in dozens of yards where artillery worked in miles, and it could not be moved, which meant it was only any use in an attack planned months ahead, on ground chosen months ahead, against a trench that had to still be there when the day came. And one German shell in the right place reduced the entire apparatus to scrap, which is precisely what happened to half of them before the battle even started. One bleak footnote remains, and it is the sharpest thing in all of this. Livens designed something else as well. A crude, cheap, mortar-like tube that could be dug in by the hundred and used to throw drums of gas or oil into enemy positions. It was simple enough to be produced in enormous numbers, and it was used for the rest of the war on a scale the flame projector never approached. It bears his name too. When people say the Livens projector today, that is usually the one they mean. So the same man produced 2 weapons. One was an engineering marvel built to drive defenders off a parapet. 4 were prepared for the Somme, only 2 ever fired there, and 1 further deployment is recorded before the idea was dropped. The other was a cheap steel tube for delivering gas, and it went into mass production and stayed there. The war chose. It is worth noticing which one it chose. For nearly a century, that was the end of it. No complete surviving example was known. The weapon existed in war diaries, in a handful of photographs, and in the memories of the few hundred men who had been near one. And then, not even in those. Then, in May 2010, a team of historians and battlefield archaeologists went to a field at Montagne de Capy, near Mametz, with the wartime trench maps and a fairly precise idea of where to dig. They were looking for a hole in the ground that had been filled in by a war and then farmed over for 94 years. They found it. SAP 14. One of the 2 knocked out by shellfire in 1916 collapsed on top of its own machine and left there. Valves, pipe sections, clamps, the delivery head, an extension pipe, and the crew's spanners still down there with the machine. That last detail is the one that stays with you. Not the weapon, the tools. Working from what came out of that hole, the Royal Engineers then built a full-size replica and fired it. The only reason anybody alive has seen what this thing actually did. That footage is as close as anyone will get to standing in Mine Trench at 7:15 in the morning. And the story has one more turn, a strange one. The reconstructed projector has been linked to the visual development of Smaug's fire in Peter Jackson's Hobbit films, a weapon Britain buried under a French field in 1916, dug up in 2010, turning up as the breath of a dragon. Tolkien himself was on the Somme that summer, a few miles away, in a war that had produced the actual thing. Whether he ever heard of it is not recorded, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. But the shape of the coincidence is hard to ignore. So the word that belongs on the Livens is not biggest, and it is not deadliest. It is buried, and what was buried was an argument about what a weapon is for. One case, and this is an argument about the weapon, not a claim anyone made for it at the time, says this was the most humane thing anyone built in that war, which sounds obscene until you follow it through. The Livens was built to move men off a firing step rather than to kill them where they stood, and in the one sector where it fired properly, British infantry crossed no man's land and lived. On that ground, on that day, saving that many men is not a small claim. If terror empties a firing step and lets an attack succeed cheaply, terror is the humane option, and refusing to use it costs your own men their lives. The other case says, look at what is actually being defended here. It is a machine engineered to burn men alive in front of their friends, and the fact that the planners cared more about the panic than the burning does not improve it. It makes it worse. The burning was the mechanism. The men killed in that trench were not a regrettable side effect of the terror. They were how the terror was manufactured. Nobody who built this thought of it as merciful, and calling it merciful a century later is a comfort we are awarding ourselves. A nation that builds on that principle has decided something about itself that no casualty figure will settle. Both cases rest in the same buried tube in the same French field, and digging it up did not resolve them either. What came out of the ground was fragments, the last remains of 4 machines, none of which was ever meant to be found, built to do something to men's minds and then abandoned because doing it cost too much. So we will put it to you. Was the Livens the most merciful weapon Britain built in that war, or the most honest about what it was doing? Tell us in the comments, and if you think this film came down on the wrong side, say so plainly. And if you want more of the war Britain fought underground, subscribe. Most of it is still down there.